Hi, I'm Maria Bach.
Hello, I'm François Allisson, and we are here to have a conversation on Indian economics and Russian economics as part of this conference on the history of economic thought that we are having at Azim Premji University. Can I ask you a few questions about your specialty, because you seem to work on Indian economic thought, and I wonder how you came to that subject.
Oh, yeah, it's a question I get all the time. Why is a Swede working on Indian economics? So I did an economics training and was very interested in development economics, and I came to kind of understand that India had this really interesting history of its development. And at the same time, I was introduced to history of economics in my master's at SOAS in London. And it really struck me that we're taught economics as undergraduates, but we're not told when these models come about, by whom, what their education is, what their thoughts are about the economy. And so if you mix development economics and history of economics together, it turned out to be Indian economics, just because I fell upon, thanks to my supervisor, a text written by one of the early nationalists in India that talked about the need for an Indian economics in 1892.
So you just mentioned Indian nationalism. How is it connected with economics?
Good point, yeah. So there was this movement kind of beginning in the 1870s or so, when India had been colonized, one could say several centuries by the British, but formally colonized by the British since the late 1850s. And they came with this idea that they were going to civilize the Indians, right? And that's why they were there, and so to bring progress, etc. And there was this group of Indians. They were Indian officials working for the government, or they were had legal degrees, or they were teachers, and they just saw that India was getting worse. There were really severe famines and so on. So they thought, why don't we study the Indian economy to understand why there's poverty, so we can teach the British to implement better policies that would alleviate this poverty. And they're called the early nationalists because through their research they start to realize that the British weren't going to do anything about Indian progress. And so they said that the only solution kind of by the beginning of the 20th century was to get the British out, right, to become independent.
And today, this afternoon, in your speech, you mentioned several Indian economists. Can you tell me about one of them? Or?
Yeah, well, so I guess I could start with the father of Indian economics, perhaps. And in this speech in 1892, this Madhav Ranade says that there needs to be an Indian economics, because who thinks that an economics could apply, or universal laws of economics could apply to all times and spaces? It just seemed ridiculous to him. And he becomes one of the first Indians to become a high court judge, as I said, to study the Indian economies, and then to kind of diffuse this idea about what's wrong with the Indian economy, what's not going well, what kinds of sources of wealth do they have, and how do we bring those to the surface and bring progress to India. Then there's also Dabada Naruji, who lots of people will know too, who is the first really to popularize the idea of a drain theory, so that instead of the civilizing mission that said that British would bring wealth to India, it was actually the opposite. They were draining wealth from India, so they were taking lots of money, right, taxes from India. They were also taking the raw, they were imposing kind of that the raw cotton would be exported to the and imported into Britain to fuel their industrialization of the textile industry, which completely broke down the competitiveness of the handicrafts industry in India at the time. So lots of these economists talked about deindustrialization in India at the time. And then perhaps I'll just mention one last economist, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, who's the father of agricultural economics in India. And he's really the first to say we should go out to the rural areas, interview the peasants, to actually find out what their problems are, like how are they doing well, or are they not doing well, why are they not doing well, and that knowledge actually comes from them rather than these intellectuals sitting in their cities and reading books, right? So, and reports, some of them even written by British people, right, not even their own population.
And I don't know if everyone is aware of Rostow's FiveStage theory, and you mentioned that perhaps your Indian economists were not in that kind of move. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah, so this FiveStage theory which comes after this generation, right, of Indian economists
Right.
in the 20th century, but builds on work on by Adam Smith and others on this idea that countries have maybe in different stages, so they might look different, but they're on this linear path towards development, and everybody moves through the same stages, right? And it was a way for Europeans to understand the differences that they saw in the countries that they went to. And so, to a large extent, these Indian economists said, yeah, we are different, right? We're a colony. We're clearly not. We don't have an industrial sector like Britain and other countries in Europe. And so they adopted this stage theory, right? And they adopted the different stages. So the fact that there's an agricultural stage, and then there's kind of a proto-industrial stage where capital accumulation is formed in order to build smaller industries, and then there's an industrialization, right? And they said, fine, right? These stages are there, but actually you can skip stages if you've already done that stage before, and you can move up and down those stages, right? Is what they say. And the idea is that they looked at Indian history and said, it's not like the British say that we are poor and now we're going to get better because the British are here. It's that we were much better off. We were this nation that used to trade with the rest of the world. And then the British came in and ruined that trade for us, and have now made us a more dependent agricultural economy, which is regressing our economic growth, right? So then they moved down to another stage, right? And then the idea was that if the British left, they said, and they put in industrial policies like tariff barriers, subsidies for infant industries, etc., then they would be able to skip that stage and move to this higher industrial stage, and everybody would be better off as well, which is quite a big part of the idea, is that, of course, they had to please the British, right, in their discourse, because it was the beginning of the nationalist movement, there was censorship and so on, so they couldn't say everything they wanted to say. And so they said, well, if we industrialize, we can demand more goods from you, the British, and so we'd all be better off, right? And this is what I, in my research, have called the WinWin model of development that they come up with.
And if your research conveys a message, what would it be? What would you want it to be for the audience?
I think the bigger message that I want to convey is that history of economics needs to look elsewhere than it's looked before. So this is just one example of marginalized economists that are not written into the history of economics, and we need to do that more, right? So I call on more people to look at other parts of the world, and that is, in fact, what you do, right? You look at Russian economic thought. So I'm going to ask you the same question. How did you get there?
I always had an interest in the political history of the Soviet Union as different from the other parts of the world, and by chance started to learn the language, and then I fell in love with the language, and starting from that I decided I could not make a PhD on something else than Russia, because I wanted to improve my language, and I spent 2 years in Russia learning and finding sources for a PhD, especially on sources that were never translated, to be able to bring something new on the...
And so what was your PhD topic on them? What was your question?
My question was to see how the Russian economists before the Bolshevik Revolution thought the notions of value and prices at a period where in the West the marginalist revolution took the place. Classical political economy was dismissed, but there was some competition with Marxism, and especially in Russia, marginalism arrived a bit later, and when it arrived, it was not seen by all as something that should replace the classical theory of value, but that's something that could be mixed up with the classical theory of value, even proposing a synthesis between both. Of course, a synthesis of two very different paradigms is really difficult, as Srishti Yadav told us this afternoon, but it brought very interesting developments. Yeah.
And what kinds of developments did it bring, or solutions?
They brought developments in which economic theory could mix up with ethical considerations, and it proved a viable basis for a theory of economic planning based on ethical values that would have been probably better off for the nascent Soviet Union that was going to come.
I feel like that's a common thread in when, like us, we look at other parts of the world. There is often these syntheses or kind of mixing of different schools of thought, and I think it comes from this dominance of European economic thinking, and so they have to read those texts because they're told that those are the best, and then they have that knowledge, and so they use it because that's good. Those are good tools, but then they change it and they adapt it to their own context. Have you found that?
Yeah,
would you agree?
absolutely. The same patterns, because in the countries where these schools are based, they know the respective position of each. One is dominant, the other are declining, but when they arrived in a new country, people can take them as something else. I mean, everything new is good. And seems good, and so the hierarchies of knowledge are not necessarily conveyed through the importation of theories, and therefore some mixes can appear, which are sometimes taken or often taken in the West as eclectical, but it might produce something new. And interesting.
And useful, as you said, that it might be. And what was the most surprising thing that you found in your research?
At the end of the 19th century in Russia, there is a high development of mathematical economics, highly theoretical development, and some people are taking the other road of economic statistics, going to the field, trying to count the peasants, their field, and so on. And so it's two kinds of research, and I was not expecting these statistical studies to be that important and diverse and important. But I was not surprised that both don't communicate each with other.
There was very little dialogue between these groups of economists.
Yeah. The statisticians and the mathematical economists were doing rather different things.
Why do you think that is? Why was that dialogue not there?
There was a taste for theory on one side and an envy to know the country on the other side. And so it's different kind of perception of what economic science is about and what is it for, I think.
And so talking about these archival sources, because we often think or we talk about there being less archival resources outside of Europe. Is this something that you struggle with in Russia as well, the kind of the accessibility of archival sources?
So as the Russian Empire was really a very highly bureaucratic state, there were quite a lot of archives, and I was lucky that for the period under consideration before the Bolshevik Revolution, they are not much interested in controlling the access, and so I was never restricted unless by bureaucratical rules. For example, if you arrive on Tuesday, you cannot have your files until Thursday, and then you have to come back on 2 or 3 days after. You cannot take photograph, and everything is done to make the life of researcher in the archive a bit difficult, but in the end you find what you want, because I'm not working on the Soviet period. For my piece.
In your talk earlier today, you mentioned something about the Obchina, so the Commune in Russia.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yeah, a collection of many families that are living together on the same plot and that are practicing the communal form of land ownership, and they redistribute this land within themselves on a regular basis, so that if a family grows, it needs more land. If people leave or are dying, they need less land, and so they are collectively responsible for tax payment as well, and it is a structure that imposes some kind of social control on the population that lives in this Obscina. Let's say discovered by a German scholar, the Graf August von Axthausen, who was invited by the Tsar to visit the country and gives impressions about what he saw, and he said, "Oh, you have a fantastic institution, the Russian Commune, the Obshchina, that is perfect for controlling the people, and we should have that in Germany. This is really a singular institution from the Russian economy," and the Russian were surprised because they almost didn't know about this institution, and so they made a lot of research on that, and people had different hopes about the fate of this institution. Some people thought it was the perfect institution to keep Russia as it has always been, a peasant economy with no fancy revolution like in Europe, and so it could be a means to conserve the country as it is. And on the other side, people saw in the Obshchina the revolutionary basis for reaching socialism without having to suffer and endure capitalism like in England, for example. And so they thought, okay, we want communism, but we already have it in a primitive form in the Obshchina. Let's just free the Obshchina. And on the other side, people would say, no, we won't get to socialism if we don't destroy the Obshchina, because the Obshchina is what prevents capitalism to settle in
Right, and as Karl
Russia.
Marx said, you have to have capitalism in order for there to be a revolution and then for communism to come about.
Absolutely.
I found that really pertinent when you said it earlier today, because I think there's this idea that when you travel to somewhere else, you start to learn more about where you come from, because you get questioned seeing something different about what is the norm, right? And so that's perhaps, I don't know if you would agree with me, but that's perhaps why he saw it and the Russians didn't, because they just took it for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why it is important that Russian economy studies the Russian economy and that English economy study the English economy. But it is also important to have people like you and me, perhaps. You as a Swede studying Indian economist. I'm a Swiss studying Russian economist. And I think we see what is too evident for others to see, because we don't know the country, and we are here to ask the obvious questions.
Yeah, and I wonder if there isn't something about this traveling that can produce knowledge. So one of the economists that I look at, Ramachandra Dutt, traveled to England quite a bit, and he wrote travelogues of these travels. And one of the things that shocks him and how he kind of almost starts out his book is saying there's so much poverty in England. How could a country so progressive, as he had been taught at his British university in India, how could it have poverty, right? There must be something wrong. And I think that traveling really pushed him to realize that you need to see with your own eyes what it is that you want to find out about, right? And I think that's why he went home to India and said, okay, I need to go and see these rural peasants and talk to them, right? And his history, even he started traveling at a very, very young age with his father, because his father was an official that had to go around the rural areas to see how it was going, collect taxes, etc. And so he noticed this very quickly, I think, at a young age, that traveling actually opens up your ability to see new things, understand new things, and then also to theorize about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, traveling was really important part of the formation and the education of Russian economists as well. It was even at some point institutionalized that when you study first using foreign books, then you have, before you can become a professor, to spend 1.5 years abroad, state-sponsored. You go in Germany, in England, or wherever the state of the art of economics is being taught. And yeah, they saw things. For example, Tugan Bojanowski went to London to see industrial crisis in action, but when he came back, he said, hey, maybe what I saw in London is starting here in Russia. And so, yeah, travel was important, and sometimes travel was imposed, I think, of all the exiled revolutionary economists who had to be in Europe and traveling in Europe because they were searched by the police of many countries on behalf of the Russian Tsar. And so, yeah, traveling was really an important part of their life.
Right, and I think we've mentioned some of the positive things. There are some things negative about that. You talked about this imposed travel, right? So to become an economics professor in Russia, if I've understood correctly, you had to spend some time abroad, kind of with this perhaps underlying assumption that the thought being produced and done in the Western world, which they called it at the time, or what we could call global north today, is somehow better, so that there's this hierarchy of knowledge produced in the world. Would you agree?
Yeah, there was a sense that the Western countries were more advanced from an economic point of view, and that their science, as a consequence, shall be more advanced as well. And so it was always taken as a comparison point, and the first indigenously produced handbooks, textbooks, and were seen as secondary level instructions.
I've thought about this a lot with my Indian economists. I feel like that must have such a big impact on knowledge production than elsewhere, so in the global south. Or in former Soviet Union and Russia today, that people are so convinced even there that they need to understand thought that's coming from another part of the world, which is better or higher ranked on this hierarchy of knowledge. And I find that often, at least the Indian economists that I look at, they kind of have to prove that they know all that knowledge first, and then they can say what they think. Right, and what they want to add. And it's at least what I argue in my forthcoming book is that makes it quite difficult to kind of dig out the new stuff that they were saying, that we've, at least in history of economics, it's not something we talk about a lot.
Can you remind me the title of your forthcoming book?
It's called Relocating Development Economics.
Excellent.
The first generation of Indian modern economists.
Just before you mentioned censorship, and this is something also I encountered with my Russian economists, because some were trying to say things using other words, because there was a censorship office that was allowing or forbidding text to be published, and for example, Marx Capital was authorized just because it was complex, borrowing scientific text, but it proved to be more than that. And some economists were not allowed to publish text, and so all these games made my work difficult, because sometimes when people were writing some words, they meant something else. They were writing between the lines, and people at the time know how to interpret the text.
But that's harder for you as someone working much later on.
Yeah.
I agree. I've even heard that the Indian economists that I look at, their letters were read, right? And sometimes I think that they use that to their advantage. So they would write in English even in their letters, even if perhaps they spoke the same Indian language, because then their ideas would get out there even more, you know? But one example I mentioned earlier today in my talk was this idea that they would often start speeches saying, thank you to the British, you've given us so many things, and then they would list a few things. And then by the end of the speech, they're saying, you are ruining us, we're regressing, we need to be able to build and implement our own policy. And I find that fascinating that is in the same speech, right? It took me a long time to understand how to put those two things together. And one of the main ideas one of the main conclusions, I think, is that it's a rhetorical device. I've been invited to speak. I have the privilege to be able to talk and diffuse my ideas, and I have to use that privilege carefully.
There is maybe a last question I wanted to ask you. in Russia, socialism played such an important role in the development of economic theories and in the fate of the country. How, was it the case in India as well?
Fantastic question. So I'm looking at the late 19th century, right, 1870 to 1905, and at the time, these economists were adamant that they weren't socialists. And I think in some ways this is another rhetorical device to kind of not brush. They wanted to be listened to the British, so they couldn't say they were socialists, right? But to an extent, I think they adamantly didn't think that this was the right way to organize an economy. They were pro-industrialization, etc., and pro-free trade once a country had industrialized. So socialism, no. But I'll give you a really great example. The Undabana Naruji, who came up with the joint theory, as I mentioned earlier, he talks in Amsterdam in 1904 at the International Socialist Conference, where there were lots of leading socialist voices of the time, so Rosa Luxemburg, amongst others, and there's a great photo of him still available at the Amsterdam Socialist Archives, where he's pictured along with these socialist voices, and he's there at this International Socialist Congress with lots of other countries, and he's one of the few non-Europeans that's been invited to talk about the atrocities in India, namely the famines as well as other. This Socialist Congress were well aware that they were rather anti-imperialist and understood that the imperialization of India was not a good thing, and he stood up and made this speech, in 1904, and had the attention of some 1,000 socialist voices to fight for Indian independence, right? Yet not being a socialist, right? Why was he there? So why was he there, right? And I think it's just that he understood that this group of people were ethically minded, morally minded, to understand that India needed help, they needed independence, and so here was another platform, and I would say probably one of the rare platforms where he's actually really listened to and taken seriously. So no, they were not socialists, but they had connections with the socialists. The socialists helped them to have their voice heard. So yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Russian context in your period of study.
Oh yeah. So the Russian country was ruled by a Tsar, and it was mainly a peasant economy. Yeah, the population in towns was relatively small, and there were not a lot of industries, and most industries were being state-sponsored, because the towns were not, like in Western Europe, centers of production. They were mainly centers of luxury consumption. And so all the manufacturers were mainly producing luxury goods, and at the same time they were producing military goods. But most luxury goods were imported, and for that you have to take money, and the money was taken, of course, from the countryside. And if you think of the Russian budget, from a large part came from taxes on land and so on, but also on indirect taxation on alcohol. And so with that, the Russian elites could afford the way of living. But this way of living was becoming increasingly fewer and fewer, and on an international comparison level, they saw the difference when they started to lose wars against the Ottoman Empire, and then in 1905 against Japan, which was the first time a country which considered himself Western, Russia, lose a war against a country that was not Western. And so it ringed a bell, and there were quite a few ministers who came and went out and came to reform the country. And the main reforms were to boost the industrialization, the railway network, to attract foreign capital, because the private enterprise was not really booming by itself. So it was all state and foreign-led, and they tried, but it was difficult to reform the peasant world, and especially the община, and even a prime minister of Russia was killed because of these kind of reforms at the time. So that was the situation at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, before the revolutions arise. And what about India?
Yeah, so we look at the same period around about, right? And a lot of the things you say are happening in India as well, right? They have a large agricultural economy. As I said earlier, they produce a lot of raw cotton, but also coarse cotton. So that's when it's that you could call it, to some extent, kind of an infant industry, right? This agricultural sector was large and wasn't producing a lot of income, and so there was lots of poverty among this agricultural population. And India has often had in its history droughts, and the droughts during this last few decades of the 19th century hit the Indian population particularly badly, right? And that was one of the kind of alarm bells among the Indian economists that I look at, but as well as others, and as well as other Indians, but also the British and other kind of people that had a gaze on India. And that was obviously, they wanted then answers to why this large proportion of the population weren't able to deal with these droughts as much, and they were dying from malnutrition and starvation. And part of the problem there was that the handicrafts industry that had been so large and had been exported around the world before was dying out because of the industrialization in Britain. So that just very simply meant that, you know, the textile goods in England were becoming so cheap that the world market was buying cotton from Britain rather than India, right? And so then they were losing their market. And so there was this sort of deindustrialization. Now, there are lots of debates about whether this deindustrialization happened or not. There's a great scholar, Tinkata Roy at LSE, has done lots of work on that. I'm not going to pretend to be the specialist there. So there was this large agricultural economy that was very poor, and there wasn't a lot of agricultural development. And then there was some deindustrialization and a kind of lack of larger forms of investment in industry, which really worried the Indian economists, because to them, industrialization was the only answer to progress.
Maria, what would you recommend, or how would you recommend to a student that it is important to study the history of economic thought?
Yeah, why do history of economic thought, especially when we don't offer that on our economics curricula, right? Well, so my opinion on this is that, look, if you look at conceptual histories, teach us things about our world, about how we see our world, that are really quite fundamental. You know, I look at the idea of development. I mean, I'm sure everyone here will agree that development is a good thing, but we need to understand it in order to bring it about, right? So that's the first point. And I think if we do look at conceptual histories in parts of the world where we haven't looked at it so much before, then we may have, overlooked really interesting ideas that could be useful for us even today. If you think about India today, I think industrialization is perhaps a key to bringing about more development. At least some people would agree with me. And then I think the third point, which is perhaps more general and of course my opinion as well, is that I think if we do this, we're going to start to decolonize economics, right? On the one hand, from theory, right, or theory and method, these very strong dominant ideas about how to do economics, which we have today. If we do history of economics, then we kind of battle against that a little bit, and decolonize in terms of enable former colonized countries, post-colonial countries, to have their say in economics, which I think is fundamental. How about you?
Oh, I fully agree with what you just said. I would just stress the real importance of history of economics. So for pedagogy, I think that it is so important to give a sense to students in economics that ideas are diverse and that the methods are plural. And so to give this idea of pluralism, I think, is best through history of economic thought. And on the other side, the best way to teach economics to non-economists, I think, is through the history of economics, because you go through ideas and not through technical apparatus from one current and not from the others and so on. So for teaching purpose, I think it's really important that we continue to study the history of economic thought. And as you said, it is an important resource to find new ideas in economics, because we are always looking the world from one perspective, and with the history we can take the time to view other perspectives that were overlooked as well. And perhaps also very important is that you have to do something that you love in life. And if you study the history of economic thought, it is both pertinent and it is really intellectually rewarding, because you are studying the thought of individuals from the past, and this may help us not forgetting the past and be smarter citizens of the world. And I think it's much fun to study the history of economics. At the same time, it gives us a responsibility for the world.
Well, like Alex Thomas, a professor from this Azim Premji University, said today in his lecture about what are the different definitions of economics, right? Starting in a history of economic class like that is just extraordinary, because it just makes it's so clear to students that the definition that you may be given is not the right one or the truthful one. And I think on the one hand, they realize that there are lots of ways to see the economy, and perhaps different ways of seeing the economy can bring different kinds of solutions to real problems that we have, but also to then become this critical citizen, right? And if we think about democracies, I think that's really important. Think about fake news today. I mean, we need students to leave their degrees with some kind of critical thinking, right? And if we give students these different competing views, they understand that there isn't just one dominant right idea that is just common sense, that is the right way to see things.
Yeah, exactly. And the mainstream ideas are so easily reproduced by themselves that we need to act a bit as a counterpower to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was really happy to have this conversation with you, Maria, today, and I look forward to your keynote lecture tomorrow on Indian economics.
And as do I look forward to your keynote on this Russian economist.